The radio crackled with Vietnamese voices, laughing. American intelligence officers leaned closer to their headsets, translating the intercepted transmission. "Look at these fat American supply trucks," one Viet Cong commander chuckled to another, "like feeding time at the zoo." It was January 1968. 6,000 Marines sat trapped at Khe Sanh Combat Base, surrounded by 20,000 North Vietnamese regulars. Every supply convoy that tried to reach them became a death sentence on wheels. Route 9, the only road to the base, had turned into a 14-mile killing field. But the Viet Cong had no idea what was coming. Route 9 wasn't much of a road to begin with. This narrow, winding strip of asphalt cut through the mountains of South Vietnam's Quang Tri province like a scar across hostile territory. For the 6,000 Marines defending Khe Sanh Combat Base, it represented their only lifeline to the outside world. The highway stretched 14 grueling miles from the base eastward to Ca Lu, where it connected to larger supply routes. But those 14 miles might as well have been 14,000. Every curve, every hill, every bridge offered the perfect ambush site for an enemy that knew the terrain better than the Americans ever would. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong had spent months studying this road. They mapped every pothole, every culvert, every tree line that could hide a rocket-propelled grenade team. Intelligence reports later revealed the enemy had detailed sketches of convoy patterns, timing schedules, and even the radio frequencies American drivers used. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Dense jungle pressed against both sides of Route 9, offering countless hiding spots for enemy fighters. The road itself forced vehicles into single file through most sections, creating perfect kill zones where one disabled truck could stop an entire convoy. Steep hillsides provided elevated firing positions that gave attackers clear shots at American vehicles below. Previous ambushes had proven devastatingly effective. In December 1967, a supply convoy lost 7 trucks and 13 men in a single attack. The enemy had used a combination of command-detonated mines, RPG teams positioned in the tree line, and automatic weapons fire from concealed bunkers. By the time American forces could respond, the attackers had melted back into the jungle. These early successes built dangerous confidence within Viet Cong ranks. Captured documents showed enemy commanders bragging about their ability to feast on American supplies. They weren't just destroying convoys, they were capturing weapons, ammunition, and equipment that would later be used against American forces. American commanders initially underestimated the threat. Military doctrine emphasized firepower and mobility, assuming that superior technology and training would overcome any local disadvantages. The idea that a ragtag force of guerrillas could effectively cut off a major military installation seemed impossible to career officers who had fought conventional wars in Korea and World War II. This underestimation proved costly. Intelligence reports from late 1967 showed that enemy forces had detailed knowledge of American supply schedules, convoy compositions, and even the personal habits of individual truck drivers. Someone was feeding information directly to the Viet Cong, but American security procedures remained lax. The psychological aspect of the supply war became as important as the physical destruction. Every successful ambush sent a message to both American forces and the local population. The mighty U.S. military couldn't even protect its own supply trucks. This perception encouraged more locals to cooperate with the Viet Cong while undermining American morale. Route 9 had become more than a road. It was a symbol of American vulnerability. The enemy understood that cutting supply lines could be more effective than direct assault on fortified positions. Why attack Khe Sanh's bunkers when you could starve the defenders into submission? The terrain itself seemed to favor the defenders of this deadly highway. Monsoon rains turned dirt shoulders into impassable mud, forcing vehicles to stay on the narrow pavement where they became easy targets. Morning fog provided perfect cover for enemy movement, while the mountainous landscape made air support difficult and often impossible. By early January 1968, Route 9 had effectively become impassable. The last successful supply convoy had fought through 3 separate ambushes, losing half its vehicles and most of its cargo. The Marines at Khe Sanh were now completely cut off from ground resupply, dependent entirely on dangerous airdrops that often fell into enemy hands. The Viet Cong had achieved something remarkable. They had turned America's technological superiority against itself. Every truck, every radio, every piece of equipment that fell into their hands made them stronger while weakening American forces. The supply war had become a feeding frenzy, and the Americans were the prey. The Viet Cong didn't just get lucky with their ambushes. They had something far more valuable than luck. They had inside information. American intelligence officers would later discover the shocking extent of enemy penetration into South Vietnamese forces, but by then, dozens of convoys had already paid the price. The infiltration started at the top. South Vietnamese army units responsible for convoy security were riddled with Viet Cong sympathizers. These weren't just low-level informants passing along gossip. They were sergeants, lieutenants, and even captains who had access to detailed operational plans. When American commanders briefed their South Vietnamese counterparts on convoy schedules, they might as well have been broadcasting directly to enemy headquarters. Radio intercepts revealed the devastating scope of the intelligence leak. In one captured transmission from January 1968, a Viet Cong commander detailed the exact departure time, vehicle count, and cargo manifest of a supply convoy that wouldn't leave Kha Lu for another 6 hours. The information was so precise, it included the name of the convoy commander and his radio call sign. But the betrayal went deeper than military infiltration. The local population along Route 9 had become an extensive intelligence network for the enemy. Village children would count trucks and report to Viet Cong agents. Farmers working near the highway would note the timing of American patrols. Even vendors selling food to American soldiers were gathering information about unit strengths and supply needs. American communication security was practically non-existent. Convoy commanders used standard radio frequencies that any enemy operator with basic equipment could monitor. They discussed routes, timing, and cargo loads over unsecured channels, apparently unaware that the Viet Cong had sophisticated radio intercept capabilities. Captured documents showed that enemy forces had compiled detailed profiles of individual American radio operators, including their speech patterns and personal habits. The intelligence war became personal in ways that terrified American forces. Viet Cong operatives knew the names of convoy drivers, their hometowns, even details about their families. In one psychological warfare broadcast, an enemy radio operator addressed a specific truck driver by name, mentioning his girlfriend back in Ohio and warning that he wouldn't live to see her again. The driver had never told anyone in Vietnam about his personal life, yet somehow the enemy knew intimate details. Communication security failures extended beyond radio transmissions. American forces routinely discussed operational plans in front of South Vietnamese interpreters, mechanics, and support staff. Many of these individuals had family members in Viet Cong-controlled areas and faced impossible choices between protecting American lives and protecting their own families. The enemy exploited these human vulnerabilities with ruthless efficiency. The human cost of compromised operations became clear in specific, documented cases. On January 15, 1968, a convoy commander received last-minute orders to change his route due to intelligence reports of enemy activity. Within hours, Viet Cong forces had repositioned their ambush teams to the new route. The convoy walked directly into a coordinated attack that killed 8 Americans and destroyed 5 vehicles. Someone had passed along the route change in real time. Intelligence failures created a paranoia that infected the entire command structure. American officers began suspecting their South Vietnamese counterparts, their interpreters, even their own radio operators. This suspicion destroyed the trust necessary for effective military cooperation. Units started operating in isolation, sharing minimal information even with Allied forces, which made coordination nearly impossible. The enemy's intelligence network extended into American rear areas. Viet Cong agents working as laborers on American bases reported on supply levels, equipment maintenance, and personnel movements. They knew when Khe Sanh was running low on ammunition, when medical supplies were critically needed, and when morale was at its lowest point. This information allowed enemy commanders to time their attacks for maximum psychological impact. Perhaps most damaging was the enemy's ability to predict American responses to their attacks. Captured battle plans showed that Viet Cong commanders knew exactly how American forces would react to convoy ambushes, which units would respond, how long it would take them to arrive, and what routes they would use. This knowledge allowed enemy forces to set up secondary ambushes that targeted rescue and reinforcement operations. The intelligence war had turned the Americans into an open book. Every plan, every movement, every weakness was known to an enemy that remained largely invisible. The Viet Cong had achieved what military theorists call information dominance. They could see their opponents clearly while remaining hidden themselves. This advantage made their mockery of American supply efforts not just psychological warfare, but a statement of fact. They really did know everything. The first massacre happened on a Tuesday morning in November 1967. Convoy Alpha 7 left Kalu at 800 hours with 12 vehicles carrying ammunition and medical supplies to Khe Sanh. The lead driver, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez from Texas, had made this run 17 times before. He knew every curve in Route 9, every pothole that could shake loose a truck's cargo. What he didn't know was that 40 Viet Cong fighters had spent 3 days preparing his death. The ambush site was perfectly chosen, a narrow section of road where the highway curved around a steep hillside. Dense jungle pressed against both sides, leaving nowhere to maneuver. The enemy had buried a 250-pound mine under the asphalt at the curve's apex, right where the lead vehicle would have to slow down. Secondary explosive devices were positioned to catch vehicles trying to escape forward or backward. At 8:47 hours, Rodriguez's truck hit the primary mine. The explosion lifted the 5-ton vehicle completely off the road, flipping it twice before it crashed into the tree line. Rodriguez died instantly, along with his passenger, Corporal James Murphy from Ohio. The blast crater was 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep, completely blocking the narrow highway. The surviving convoy vehicles had exactly 3 seconds before the real killing began. RPG teams positioned on the hillside above opened fire simultaneously, their rockets streaking down into the trapped convoy like deadly fireworks. The second truck exploded in a fireball that sent burning ammunition skyward. The third vehicle took a direct hit to its fuel tank, creating a wall of flame that separated the convoy's front and rear elements. Automatic weapons fire erupted from concealed positions on both sides of the road. The Viet Cong had positioned their shooters in spider holes and camouflaged bunkers that were invisible until they opened fire. Truck drivers tried to return fire with their M16 rifles, but they were shooting at muzzle flashes while enemy fighters had clear targets silhouetted against burning vehicles. The entire ambush lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, 7 trucks were destroyed, 5 Americans were dead, and 13 were wounded. But the material losses were even more devastating than the casualties. The convoy had been carrying 40,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, 200 mortar rounds, and critical medical supplies including blood plasma and antibiotics. All of it now belonged to the Viet Cong. Within hours, enemy radio intercepts revealed how quickly news of the victory spread through Viet Cong ranks. "The fat American trucks burned like torches," one commander reported to his superiors. "Our fighters took many weapons and much ammunition. The Americans run like rabbits when we bite them." The psychological impact on American forces was immediate and devastating. Truck drivers who had previously considered convoy duty relatively safe suddenly understood they were driving through a shooting gallery. Some requested transfers to infantry units, reasoning that walking through the jungle was safer than driving Route 9. Others began making wills and writing final letters home before each convoy run. But the Viet Cong weren't finished. 3 days after the Rodriguez convoy massacre, they struck again. This time, the target was a fuel convoy carrying aviation gasoline for Khe San's helicopters. The enemy used a different tactic, a coordinated attack involving mines, mortars, and direct assault teams that overran disabled vehicles to capture equipment and prisoners. The fuel convoy ambush was even more devastating than the first. Burning gasoline created an inferno that could be seen for miles, sending a black smoke column high into the sky like a funeral pyre for American logistics. 4 tanker trucks were destroyed, along with their escorts. The loss of aviation fuel meant fewer helicopter missions to resupply Khe Sanh, creating a cascading effect that weakened the entire base. Enemy confidence grew with each successful attack. Captured documents from this period show Viet Cong commanders openly bragging about their ability to feast on American supplies. They weren't just destroying convoys, they were systematically weakening American fighting capability while strengthening their own forces with captured weapons and equipment. The convoy massacres had a ripple effect throughout the Marine garrison at Khe Sanh. Supplies that should have lasted weeks were now rationed by the day. Ammunition was counted by the round. Medical supplies dwindled to critical levels just as enemy artillery attacks intensified. The Marines began to understand a terrifying truth. They were being slowly starved into submission by an enemy that could strike anywhere, anytime, and then disappear like ghosts into the jungle. By January 21, 1968, Route 9 had become a graveyard of twisted metal and burned-out trucks. The last convoy to attempt the run had been destroyed so completely that American commanders couldn't even identify how many vehicles had been lost. The road was now officially impassable, and 6,000 Marines at Khe Sanh Combat Base found themselves completely cut off from the outside world. The timing wasn't coincidental. North Vietnamese General Von Nguyen Giap had orchestrated the siege to coincide with the Tet Offensive, drawing American attention and resources away from major cities while trapping a significant Marine force in the remote mountains. 20,000 NVA regulars now surrounded Khe Sanh in a ring of steel, their artillery positions carefully sighted to cover every approach to the base. The first artillery rounds began falling at 5:30 hours on January 21st. The barrage was unlike anything the Marines had experienced. Coordinated fire from 130mm guns, 120mm rockets, and 82mm mortars that had been pre-registered on every significant target within the base perimeter. The enemy had spent months mapping Khe Sanh's defenses, and their gunners knew exactly where to aim. The main ammunition dump took a direct hit within the first 10 minutes, creating an explosion that registered on seismographs in Saigon. 27 Marines died in that single blast, and the secondary explosions continued for hours as stockpiled artillery rounds cooked off in the intense heat. The fireball rose 1,500 feet into the air, visible to enemy observers positioned on the surrounding hills, who adjusted their fire based on the destruction they could see. But the loss of ammunition was just the beginning. The base's fuel depot erupted in flames after a rocket attack, destroying 1,400 tons of aviation gasoline and diesel fuel. Without fuel, helicopter resupply missions became nearly impossible. The Marines were now dependent on dangerous parachute drops from high-flying cargo planes, and many of those supply bundles drifted into enemy-controlled territory. Food supplies dwindled rapidly as the siege intensified. The base had been designed to support normal operations with regular resupply, not to withstand a prolonged siege. Marines began rationing sea rations, cutting daily food intake to 2 meals per day, then 1. Water became critically scarce when enemy artillery damaged the main pumping station. Troops were reduced to collecting rainwater in helmets and ponchos. Medical supplies reached crisis levels within the first week of the siege. The base hospital, already overwhelmed by artillery casualties, ran out of blood plasma, antibiotics, and morphine. Navy corpsmen performed surgery by candlelight when the generators failed, using instruments sterilized with whiskey when proper medical supplies ran out. Wounded Marines lay on stretchers in bunkers, waiting for helicopter evacuations that might never come. The enemy's psychological warfare campaign intensified as conditions worsened. Loudspeakers positioned in the surrounding hills broadcast propaganda messages in English, taunting the trapped Marines with descriptions of the hot meals and warm beds waiting for them if they surrendered. "Marines, you are surrounded by the People's Army," the voices echoed across the base. "Your government has abandoned you to die in these mountains." Attempts to break through by ground proved suicidal. A reinforced company of Marines tried to fight their way down Route 9 to establish a supply corridor, but they were ambushed within 2 miles of the base perimeter. Only half the unit made it back, carrying their wounded through enemy fire while abandoning their vehicles and heavy equipment. The siege had achieved exactly what General Giap intended. It had turned Khe Sanh into a symbol of American vulnerability. Media reports from the besieged base dominated headlines worldwide, drawing comparisons to the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier. The parallels were uncomfortable for American commanders who remembered how that siege had ended with French surrender and the collapse of colonial rule in Indochina. As January turned to February, the Marines at Khe Sanh faced a grim reality. They were completely isolated, running out of supplies and under constant attack by an enemy that seemed to know their every weakness. The Viet Cong mockery of American supply convoys had evolved into something far more serious, a systematic strangulation of an entire military base. The question was no longer whether the enemy could disrupt American logistics, but whether the Marines could survive long enough for help to arrive. President Lyndon Johnson stared at the map of Khe Sanh spread across his desk in the Oval Office. The red pins marking enemy positions formed an almost perfect circle around the Marine base. "I don't want any damn Dien Bien Phu," he told his advisors, mangling the pronunciation of Dien Bien Phu, but making his point crystal clear. The siege had to be broken, whatever the cost. The answer came in the form of Operation Niagara, the most concentrated bombing campaign in military history. General William Westmoreland had convinced Johnson that American air power could accomplish what ground forces couldn't: clear the enemy positions surrounding Khe Sanh and reopen the supply lines. The operation would unleash the full fury of the U.S. Air Force against an enemy that had grown too confident in their mountain strongholds. B-52 Stratofortresses began arriving at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam by the dozens. These massive bombers, each capable of carrying 30 tons of explosives, would form the backbone of Niagara. The Strategic Air Command had never been used in a tactical support role like this, but the siege of Khe Sanh demanded unprecedented measures. The first B-52 strike hit the hills around Khe Sanh on January 22, 1968. 18 bombers dropped 540 tons of high explosives in a single pass, targeting suspected enemy artillery positions and supply routes. The explosions were so massive they registered on seismographs across Southeast Asia. Marines in the bunkers at Khe Sanh felt the ground shake beneath their feet as the bombs fell just outside their perimeter. But the enemy adapted faster than American planners expected. Within days of the first B-52 strikes, North Vietnamese forces had moved their artillery pieces into caves and underground bunkers that were immune to bombing. They learned to recognize the distinctive sound of approaching stratofortresses and would scatter from their positions, only to return after the bombers had passed. The bombing campaign escalated rapidly. By February, B-52s were flying 3 missions per day around Khe Sanh, dropping an average of 1,300 tons of bombs every 24 hours. Fighter bombers added another 300 tons daily, targeting anything that moved in the surrounding jungle. The tonnage being dropped exceeded what had been used against Germany during entire months of World War II. Artillery spotters at Khe Sanh called in strikes on suspected enemy positions with increasing desperation. Every muzzle flash, every movement in the tree line, every suspicious shadow became a target for American bombers. The hills around the base were being systematically deforested, turned into a moonscape of craters and splintered trees. Yet the enemy artillery continued to fall on the Marine positions with deadly accuracy. Intelligence reports revealed the limited effectiveness of the massive bombing effort. Captured North Vietnamese soldiers reported that their units had suffered casualties from the airstrikes, but their command structure remained intact. The enemy had learned to fight from deep bunkers and tunnel systems that could withstand direct hits from 750-pound bombs. They emerged to fire their weapons, then disappeared underground before American aircraft could respond. The psychological impact of Operation Niagara worked both ways. The constant thunder of bombing runs reassured the trapped Marines that they hadn't been forgotten, that massive resources were being committed to their relief. But it also demonstrated the enemy's resilience. If this level of firepower couldn't dislodge them, what would? Viet Cong radio intercepts during this period showed a shift in enemy propaganda. Instead of mocking American supply convoys, they began boasting about their ability to survive the bombing campaign. "The Americans dropped their bombs like rain," one intercepted message read, "but we are the mountains, and mountains do not fear rain." The bombing had unintended consequences for future supply operations. Many of the roads and trails that could have been used for ground resupply were now impassable, cratered by American bombs. The intensive air operations also drew enemy anti-aircraft units to the area, making helicopter resupply missions even more dangerous than before. By the end of February, Operation Niagara had dropped over 75,000 tons of bombs around Khe Sanh, more explosive power than the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The landscape had been transformed into an alien wasteland of craters and debris. Yet the siege continued. Enemy artillery still fell on the Marine base, and Route 9 remained impassable. The bombing campaign had become a demonstration of American firepower, but it hadn't solved the fundamental problem. The Marines were still trapped, and the enemy was still there. With Route 9 turned into a death trap and the bombing campaign failing to break the siege, the Marines at Khe Sanh faced a terrifying reality. Their only lifeline was now a thin thread of aircraft flying through some of the most dangerous airspace in Vietnam. The enemy had turned the skies above the base into a shooting gallery, and American pilots were paying the price in blood. Captain William Dabney watched from his hilltop position as a C-130 Hercules transport plane approached Khe Sanh's airstrip through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Red tracers streaked up from the surrounding hills like deadly fireworks, and black puffs of flak burst around the lumbering cargo plane. The pilot was trying to land 15 tons of ammunition and medical supplies, but first he had to survive what pilots were calling the gauntlet. The C-130 touched down hard on the damaged runway, its engines screaming as the pilot kept maximum power in case he needed to abort the landing. Ground crews sprinted toward the aircraft before it had even stopped rolling, knowing they had maybe 3 minutes to unload cargo before enemy mortars found the range. The plane's cargo ramp dropped, and Marines began throwing supply pallets onto trucks with desperate efficiency. Then the mortars started falling. The first round hit 50 yards from the aircraft, sending shrapnel whistling through the air. The second was closer. The C-130's engines roared as the pilot prepared for an emergency takeoff, cargo ramps still open, supplies as scattered across the tarmac. The third mortar round hit the runway just as the transport lifted off, its landing gear barely clearing the explosion. That was one of the lucky ones. Other cargo planes weren't so fortunate. On February 11th, a C-130 carrying blood plasma and antibiotics took a direct hit from a 122mm rocket while attempting to land. The aircraft cartwheeled across the runway in a ball of flame, killing all 6 crew members and destroying critical medical supplies that couldn't be replaced. The wreckage burned for hours, sending a black smoke column into the sky that enemy spotters used to adjust their fire. Helicopter resupply missions faced even worse odds. The CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters trying to reach Khe Sanh had to fly low and slow, making them perfect targets for enemy gunners hidden in the Su Uri jungle. The helicopters carried smaller loads than the C-130s, but they could land in areas away from the main airstrip, reducing the risk to the base's primary runway. Marine pilot Captain Stephen Hansen described flying these missions as controlled suicide. His helicopter had been hit by ground fire on 7 different supply runs, with bullet holes stitched across the fuselage and one engine damaged by shrapnel. Every time we lifted off, we knew some of us weren't coming back, he later recalled. But those Marines on the ground were depending on us. The statistics were brutal. During the siege, helicopter units supporting Khe Sanh suffered casualty rates exceeding 60%. Some squadrons lost so many aircraft that they couldn't maintain normal operations. Replacement helicopters and crews were rushed to Vietnam, but they often arrived just in time to join the casualty lists. Parachute drops from high altitude became the safest method of resupply, but they came with their own problems. Supply bundles dropped from 10,000 feet often drifted into enemy-controlled territory, especially when monsoon winds were strong. Marines watched helplessly as pallets of ammunition and food floated down into Viet Cong hands. In some cases, more supplies reached the enemy than reached the intended recipients. Equipment failures compounded the dangers. Parachutes that failed to open sent supply bundles crashing into Marine positions at terminal velocity. One failed drop killed 2 Marines and wounded 5 others when a pallet of artillery shells landed directly on their bunker. Weather added another layer of complexity. Monsoon rains and low clouds often made air operations impossible for days at a time. The heroes of the air supply effort paid a terrible price. Transport pilots flew mission after mission into the flak-filled skies above Khe Sanh, knowing that each landing could be their last. Helicopter crews volunteered for additional flights even after their aircraft had been damaged by enemy fire. Loadmasters and ground crews worked under constant bombardment to keep the supplies flowing. As February dragged on, the losses mounted. The enemy had effectively turned Khe Sanh's airspace into a no-fly zone patrolled by their anti-aircraft guns and rockets. Every supply flight became a desperate gamble, and the Marines on the ground knew that their survival depended on pilots willing to fly into hell itself. The voice came through the radio at 0300 hours, speaking perfect English with just a hint of Vietnamese accent. "Good morning, Marines of Khe Sanh. This is your friend from the People's Army. How did you sleep last night? Not very well, I think, with all those mortars falling on your heads." Lieutenant Colonel David Lowndes, commander of Khe Sanh, listened to the transmission with growing anger. The enemy wasn't just attacking his base, they were taunting his men with a sophistication that suggested extensive intelligence about American operations. The psychological warfare campaign had become as coordinated and deadly as the artillery barrages. The broadcasts came at all hours, transmitted on frequencies the Marines used for tactical communications. Enemy operators had clearly monitored American radio traffic long enough to learn call signs, unit designations, and even personal details about individual Marines. "Sergeant Johnson from Alabama," one voice said during a February broadcast, "Your mama sent you a letter last week. Too bad you'll never read it." How did they know about personal mail? The question haunted American commanders who realized their security had been compromised at levels they'd never imagined. The enemy wasn't just intercepting military communications, they had access to information that should have been completely secure. Every personal detail they revealed on the radio was another psychological blow against Marines already pushed to their breaking point. The propaganda broadcasts mixed truth with lies in ways designed to maximize psychological damage. "Your government has abandoned you," the voices would say. "President Johnson sits in his comfortable White House while you starve in these mountains. Your officers eat hot food while you get cold sea rations. Your country doesn't care if you live or die." Some of it was true enough to sting. The Marines were indeed starving, living on half rations while enemy artillery made resupply nearly impossible. Officers did sometimes receive better food when supply drops made it through. The broadcasts took these legitimate grievances and weaponized them against American morale. But the enemy's most effective psychological weapon was their use of captured American equipment. Radio intercepts revealed Viet Cong units openly discussing the weapons and supplies they'd taken from destroyed convoys. "Today we captured 10 M16 rifles and 2,000 rounds of ammunition," one transmission boasted. "Tomorrow, we will use these American weapons to kill more Americans." The sight of enemy fighters using captured American equipment was devastating to Marine morale. During one attack on the base perimeter, Marines reported seeing Viet Cong soldiers wearing American helmets and flak jackets taken from convoy ambushes. The enemy was literally wearing the uniforms of dead Americans while attacking their former comrades. Captured documents revealed the systematic nature of the psychological campaign. North Vietnamese political officers had prepared detailed propaganda scripts designed to exploit American cultural weaknesses. They referenced specific American holidays, mentioned popular songs from home, and even discussed American sports scores obtained from intercepted radio broadcasts. The enemy understood that psychological warfare could be more effective than conventional attacks. Breaking American morale didn't require expensive artillery shells or sophisticated weapons. It just required detailed intelligence and the ability to broadcast at the right moment. When Marines were exhausted, hungry, and under fire, a voice reminding them of home could be more devastating than a mortar barrage. American attempts to counter the propaganda proved largely ineffective. Military censors tried to restrict personal information in letters and radio transmissions, but the damage was already done. The enemy had demonstrated their ability to reach into the most private aspects of American military life. Every Marine now wondered what personal details the enemy might broadcast next. The psychological impact extended beyond individual morale to unit cohesion. Marines began suspecting anyone with access to personal information: clerks, radio operators, even their own officers. The trust necessary for effective military operations was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that understood American psychology better than Americans understood themselves. As the siege dragged on, the mockery became more sophisticated and more personal. The enemy had evolved from laughing at fat American supply trucks to conducting precision psychological strikes against individual Marines. They had turned the airwaves into another battlefield, and they were winning. By February 15th, the Marines at Khe Sanh had been living underground for 3 weeks. The base that once housed 6,000 men in relative comfort had become a network of rat-infested bunkers and collapsed trenches. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste permeated every corner of the compound. This wasn't just a military siege, it was a descent into hell. Marine Corporal Danny Williams from Detroit hadn't seen sunlight in 4 days. His bunker, carved into the red clay soil of the base perimeter, leaked constantly during the monsoon rains. Water mixed with mud to create a reddish soup that soaked through uniforms and equipment. Williams shared the cramped space with 7 other Marines, sleeping in shifts because there wasn't room for everyone to lie down at once. The daily artillery barrage had become as predictable as sunrise. At 05:30 hours, the first 130mm shells would begin falling, followed by rocket attacks that could last for hours. The Marines had learned to recognize different types of incoming fire by sound: the whistle of artillery shells, the whoosh of rockets, the distinctive crack of recoilless rifle rounds. They could tell where shells would land by the pitch of their approach, diving for cover with practiced precision. But the constant bombardment was taking its toll on men's minds as well as their bodies. Shell shock, what military psychiatrists now called combat stress reaction, was becoming epidemic. Marines who had been steady under fire for months suddenly couldn't stop their hands from shaking. Others stared blankly at nothing, unresponsive to orders or conversation. The base's medical officer, Navy Lieutenant Commander Richard Suter, reported that psychological casualties were beginning to outnumber physical wounds. Food had become an obsession that dominated every conversation. The Marines were down to one C-ration meal per day, supplemented by whatever edible plants they could find growing around their positions. Some units had resorted to eating rats caught in the bunkers, joking grimly that they tasted like chicken. The hunger was constant, gnawing, made worse by the knowledge that enemy forces in the surrounding hills were probably eating better than they were. Water was even more critical than food. The base's main water supply had been contaminated by artillery strikes, forcing Marines to collect rainwater in helmets and ponchos. Dysentery spread through the garrison like wildfire, weakening men who were already malnourished and exhausted. The base's latrines had been destroyed by shelling, forcing Marines to relieve themselves in empty ammunition boxes that were rarely emptied due to the constant bombardment. Medical care had deteriorated to Civil War standards. The base hospital, built to handle routine injuries and illnesses, was overwhelmed with casualties from the daily artillery attacks. Wounded Marines lay on stretchers in the bunkers, waiting for helicopter evacuations that might never come. Morphine supplies had run out in the first week of February, forcing corpsmen to perform surgery and treat wounds with nothing but alcohol for anesthesia. The psychological pressure was intensified by the Marines' isolation from the outside world. Mail delivery had stopped completely when Route 9 became impassable. The last newspapers had arrived in January, leaving the garrison cut off from news about the war or events back home. Rumors spread like wildfire through the bunkers. Some claimed that other Marine bases had fallen. Others insisted that massive reinforcements were on the way. Sleep became impossible under the constant stress. Even during lulls in the bombardment, Marines lay awake, listening for the whistle of incoming shells. Many developed a condition the corpsmen called the 1,000-yard stare, a blank, haunted expression that came from seeing too much death and destruction. Young men who had arrived in Vietnam months earlier as confident warriors now looked like hollow-eyed survivors of some natural disaster. Leadership challenges multiplied as the siege wore on. Officers struggled to maintain discipline among men who were hungry, exhausted, and increasingly convinced they had been abandoned by their government. Some Marines began questioning orders, arguing that certain positions were too dangerous to hold. Others simply stopped following commands, retreating into catatonic withdrawal that made them useless as fighters. The enemy's psychological warfare campaign exploited every weakness. The nightly propaganda broadcasts reminded the Marines of their deteriorating condition, their isolation, their government's apparent willingness to sacrifice them for political objectives they didn't understand. "Look around you, Marines," the voices would say. "You are dying for nothing in these mountains while your leaders sleep safely in Saigon." As February dragged toward March, the question was no longer whether Khe Sanh could hold out indefinitely. It was whether the Marines would retain their sanity long enough for relief to arrive. The base had become a pressure cooker of human suffering, and the lid was beginning to crack. General William Westmoreland stared at the intelligence reports spread across his desk in Saigon. The numbers told a grim story. Khe Sanh had been under siege for 37 days. Supply drops were failing at a catastrophic rate, and Marine casualties were mounting daily. But what worried him most was the political pressure coming from Washington. President Johnson called twice daily for updates, haunted by comparisons to Dien Bien Phu and the French defeat that had ended colonial rule in Indochina. "We cannot allow Khe Sanh to become another Dien Bien Phu," Johnson had told Westmoreland during their last conversation. The message was clear. The siege had to be broken, whatever the cost. The credibility of American military power was at stake, and failure was not an option. The solution came from an unexpected source. Major General John Tolson, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, had been studying the Khe Sanh situation from his headquarters at An Khe. His division represented something new in military history, an entire combat force designed around helicopter mobility. If anyone could break through the enemy ring around Khe Sanh, it would be the air cavalry. Tolson's concept was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to fight up Route 9 through prepared enemy positions, his helicopters would leapfrog over the Viet Cong defenses entirely. The 1st Cavalry would establish a series of landing zones in the mountains around Khe Sanh, creating a new supply corridor through the air rather than on the ground. It was helicopter warfare on a scale never before attempted. But the challenges were staggering. The enemy controlled the high ground around Khe Sanh, with an estimated 20,000 troops positioned in carefully prepared defensive positions. Anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles made helicopter operations extremely dangerous. Weather conditions in the mountains were unpredictable, with monsoon rains and low clouds that could ground aircraft for days at a time. The operation would require unprecedented coordination between multiple services. Air Force B-52s would continue their bombing campaign to suppress enemy positions. Navy and Marine Corps fighters would provide close air support for the helicopter assaults. Artillery units would have to coordinate their fires with aircraft operating at low altitudes in confined spaces. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. Hundreds of helicopters, thousands of troops, and massive amounts of ammunition and supplies would have to be moved into position without alerting the enemy. Intelligence gathering became critical to the operation's success. Reconnaissance teams were inserted into the mountains around Khe Sanh to identify suitable landing zones and map enemy positions. Photo reconnaissance flights provided detailed imagery of the terrain, but they also revealed the extent of enemy preparations. The Viet Cong had spent months fortifying their positions with bunkers, trenches, and anti-aircraft sites that covered every likely approach route. Weather presented another major challenge. The monsoon season was at its peak, with heavy rains and low visibility that made helicopter operations nearly impossible. Flight crews would have to navigate through mountain valleys in conditions that would normally ground all aircraft. The margin for error was zero. A single navigation mistake could put an entire helicopter formation into enemy-controlled territory. The timeline was equally challenging. Westmoreland wanted the operation launched as soon as possible, but Tolson needed time to move his division north from Nkei and establish forward operating bases. The 1st Cavalry's helicopters would have to be positioned close enough to Khe Sanh to conduct sustained operations, but far enough from enemy artillery to remain safe. Finding suitable locations for these bases required extensive reconnaissance and engineering work. Equipment modifications became necessary for the unique challenges of the mission. Helicopters would have to carry maximum loads of troops and supplies while operating at high altitudes in thin air. Door guns were upgraded to provide better suppressive fire during landing operations. Special communications equipment was installed to coordinate the complex air-ground operations that would be required. The human factor was perhaps most critical of all. Helicopter pilots would have to fly repeated missions into heavily defended landing zones, knowing that each flight could be their last. Infantry soldiers would have to trust their lives to aircraft operating in some of the most dangerous airspace in Vietnam. The success of Operation Pegasus would depend entirely on the courage and skill of individual Americans willing to risk everything to save their surrounded comrades. As February turned to March, the pieces of Operation Pegasus began falling into place. The 1st Cavalry Division was moving north, B-52 strikes were intensifying around potential landing zones, and reconnaissance teams were providing detailed intelligence about enemy positions. The most ambitious helicopter operation in military history was about to begin. The sound was unlike anything the Vietnamese mountains had ever heard, hundreds of helicopter rotors beating the air in perfect synchronization as the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, descended on Quang Tri Province like a mechanical storm. It was March 30th, 1968, and the most mobile fighting force in military history was about to change the rules of warfare forever. Major General John Tolson watched from his command helicopter as wave after wave of UH-1 Huey transports filled the sky below him. Each aircraft carried 11 fully equipped soldiers of the 1st Cavalry, their weapons and equipment carefully balanced for the high-altitude operations they were about to conduct. The division had moved 400 miles north from their base at Nkei in just 72 hours, bringing with them 434 helicopters and 20,000 combat troops. The logistics of the deployment were staggering. The air cavalry had essentially picked up an entire division and relocated it to within striking distance of Khe Sanh without the enemy detecting the movement. Forward operating bases had been carved out of the jungle at Kalu and LZ Stud, complete with fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and maintenance facilities. Engineering units had worked around the clock to prepare landing strips capable of handling the massive CH-54 Sky Crane helicopters that would lift artillery pieces and heavy equipment into mountain positions. But this wasn't just about moving helicopters and troops. The 1st Cavalry brought a completely different philosophy of warfare to the Khe Sanh area. Where conventional forces had tried to fight their way up Route 9 through prepared enemy positions, the air cavalry would simply fly over those positions and attack from unexpected directions. They could land troops on mountaintops that the enemy considered inaccessible, establish fire bases in locations that couldn't be reached by ground forces, and move entire battalions across terrain that would take infantry days to traverse. The enemy had never faced anything like this before. Intelligence reports from captured North Vietnamese soldiers revealed their confusion and concern about American helicopter capabilities. "The sky is full of their machines," one prisoner reported. "They can put soldiers anywhere, anytime. How do we defend against an enemy that flies?" The 1st Cavalry's arrival immediately changed the tactical situation around Khe Sanh. Enemy commanders who had grown comfortable with their defensive positions suddenly found themselves vulnerable to attack from any direction. The ring of steel they had forged around the Marine base was about to be tested by an enemy that could appear anywhere without warning. Helicopter gunships began prowling the mountains around Khe Sanh, hunting for enemy positions that had remained hidden during months of B-52 strikes. The AH-1 Cobra attack helicopters carried rockets, machine guns, and grenade launchers that could deliver precision firepower to targets that were impossible to hit with conventional artillery. They flew low and fast through mountain valleys, using terrain features to mask their approach until they were close enough to engage enemy positions at point-blank range. Reconnaissance teams were inserted into areas that had been considered impenetrable enemy territory. These small units, carried by helicopters that could land on ridgelines and mountaintops, began mapping enemy positions and supply routes with unprecedented accuracy. For the first time since the siege began, American commanders had real-time intelligence about enemy movements and dispositions. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and dramatic. Marines at Khe Sanh, who had endured 37 days of isolation and bombardment, suddenly saw the sky filled with American helicopters. The sound of rotor blades became a symbol of hope after weeks of despair. They knew that relief was finally at hand, that they hadn't been abandoned in the mountains after all. But for the enemy, the arrival of the 1st Cavalry represented their worst nightmare. The static defensive positions they had spent months preparing were suddenly vulnerable to attack from above. Their supply lines, previously secure in remote mountain valleys, were now exposed to helicopter-borne assault teams. The Americans had brought a new kind of warfare to the mountains, and the rules of the game had changed completely. As March 30th drew to a close, the stage was set for the largest helicopter assault operation in military history. The 1st Cavalry Division was in position, their aircraft fueled and armed, their troops briefed and ready. Operation Pegasus was about to begin. April 1st, 1968. 600 hours. The morning mist still clung to the mountains around Khe Sanh when the first wave of helicopters lifted off from LZ Stud. It wasn't an April Fool's joke. It was the largest helicopter assault in military history, and 20,000 American troops were about to rewrite the rules of warfare. Major General John Tolson's voice crackled over the radio net as hundreds of aircraft took to the sky simultaneously. Pegasus is go. All units execute, execute, execute. The words launched an operation that would either save the Marines at Khe Sanh or become the most expensive failure in Vietnam War history. The sky filled with helicopters in perfect formation, UH-1 Huey transports carrying assault troops, AH-1 Cobra gunships providing fire support, and massive CH-47 Chinook helicopters loaded with artillery pieces and ammunition. The sound was deafening, a mechanical thunder that rolled across the mountains and valleys of Quang Tri Province. Enemy soldiers hiding in bunkers and caves had never heard anything like it. The first objective was Landing Zone Mike, a ridgeline 5 miles northeast of Khe Sanh that commanded key approaches to the besieged base. Intelligence reports indicated the area was defended by at least 2 companies of North Vietnamese regulars dug into prepared positions. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, Custer's old unit, would have the honor of the first assault. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade watched from his command helicopter as the landing zone came into view. The ridgeline had been pounded by B-52 strikes for weeks, but aerial reconnaissance showed enemy positions were still intact. Tree stumps and bomb craters dotted the landscape like broken teeth, but the bunkers remained hidden beneath layers of logs, dirt, and camouflage. The Cobra gunships went in first, their rockets and machine guns raking the landing zone with suppressive fire. Red tracers streaked down from the helicopters, while return fire sparkled from concealed enemy positions. The North Vietnamese had learned to build their bunkers deep and strong. Most of the gunship fire was absorbed by overhead cover that could withstand direct hits from 2.75-inch rockets. Then, the transport helicopters swept in, flaring hard as they approached the landing zone. The first Huey touched down at Aero 615 hours, its 11-man squad leaping out before the skids had fully settled. Within seconds, enemy fire erupted from multiple positions around the landing zone. AK-47 rounds cracked overhead as the soldiers dove for whatever cover they could find. More helicopters landed in rapid succession, disgorging their human cargo into the firefight. The landing zone became a chaos of rotor wash, muzzle flashes, and shouted commands as American soldiers spread out to engage enemy positions. Some helicopters took hits while still on the ground. One, Huey, lifted off with bullet holes stitched across its fuselage and hydraulic fluid streaming from its tail boom. But the enemy had made a critical mistake. They had positioned their defenses to repel ground attacks from predictable directions, not helicopter assaults that could come from anywhere. The Americans were landing on terrain the North Vietnamese considered inaccessible, attacking from directions they hadn't anticipated. Within 30 minutes, Landing Zone Mike was secure. Enemy resistance collapsed as American troops outflanked positions that had been impregnable to ground attack. The psychological impact was immediate. For the first time in months, American forces were advancing instead of retreating, attacking instead of defending. Similar scenes played out across multiple landing zones as the 1st Cavalry executed simultaneous assaults throughout the region. Landing Zone Cates, Landing Zone Tom, Landing Zone Wharton. Each objective was seized by helicopter-borne troops who appeared out of the sky without warning. The enemy's carefully prepared defensive positions were being rolled up from directions they had never considered. Radio intercepts revealed the confusion in enemy ranks. "The Americans are everywhere," one North Vietnamese commander reported. "They land like birds on the mountaintops. We cannot defend against attacks from the sky." By noon, on April 1st, the 1st Cavalry had established multiple fire bases within artillery range of Khe Sanh. American 105 military howitzers were being airlifted to mountaintop positions where they could support the besieged Marines for the first time in weeks. The siege that had lasted 67 days was finally being challenged by an enemy the North Vietnamese couldn't match: American air mobility. The Viet Cong, who had mocked American supply convoys, were about to learn that the Americans had found a new way to deliver supplies and reinforcements. Operation Pegasus had begun, and the sky belonged to the 1st Cavalry. The euphoria of the first day's success faded quickly as the 1st Cavalry discovered that seizing landing zones was only the beginning. Now came the brutal work of fighting through prepared enemy positions that had been months in the making. The North Vietnamese weren't going to abandon their siege of Khe Sanh without a fight, and they had turned every ridge, every valley, every trail into a killing ground. Captain James Spears of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, learned this lesson the hard way on April 2nd. His unit had been tasked with clearing Hill 471, a strategic height that dominated the approaches to Khe Sanh from the north. Intelligence reports suggested light enemy resistance, maybe a squad or two of North Vietnamese regulars. What Spears found instead was a fortress. The enemy had spent 3 months turning Hill 471 into an underground city. Bunkers connected by tunnels honeycombed the entire ridgeline, with multiple firing positions that could cover every approach. The North Vietnamese had learned from their defeats at other landing zones. They weren't going to be outflanked again. This time, they had prepared positions that could defend against attacks from any direction, including from above. Spears' first assault up the hill lasted exactly 12 minutes before withering fire from concealed positions forced his men to retreat. AK-47 rounds and RPG explosions turned the hillside into a maelstrom of flying steel and shattered rock. 2 soldiers died in the first minutes, cut down by machine gun fire from bunkers they never saw. 3 more were wounded by mortar rounds that seemed to fall with supernatural accuracy. The problem wasn't just the enemy fortifications, it was the terrain itself. The hills around Khe Sanh were covered with dense jungle that reduced visibility to a few yards. Soldiers could be within 10 feet of an enemy bunker and never see it until muzzle flashes erupted from firing slits. Every tree, every rock, every fold in the ground could conceal a North Vietnamese position. Helicopter gunships tried to suppress enemy fire, but their rockets and machine guns were largely ineffective against the deep bunkers. The Cobra pilots could see muzzle flashes, but by the time they brought their weapons to bear, the enemy soldiers had disappeared back into their tunnels. It was like fighting ghosts who could materialize anywhere, fire a few rounds, then vanish underground. Artillery support faced similar challenges. The 105mm howitzers now positioned on nearby mountaintops could deliver devastating firepower, but only if they could identify targets. Forward observers trying to call in fire missions found themselves pinned down by enemy snipers who seemed to appear and disappear at will. Radio communications were disrupted by the terrain and enemy jamming, making coordination between ground forces and supporting fires nearly impossible. The fighting became intensely personal and brutally close range. Soldiers advanced yard by yard, using grenades to clear bunkers and flamethrowers to burn out tunnel entrances. The enemy fought back with equal determination, knowing that losing these positions meant losing their stranglehold on Khe Sanh. Some bunkers changed hands multiple times in a single day as attacks and counterattacks surged back and forth across the contested ground. Casualties mounted on both sides as the battle for the high ground intensified. American soldiers who had expected a quick victory found themselves locked in the kind of grinding attritional warfare that characterized the worst battles of World War I. Every hill became a separate battle, every bunker an individual fortress that had to be taken by direct assault. The weather added another layer of misery to the fighting. Monsoon rains turned the red clay soil into slippery mud that made movement treacherous. Soldiers slipped and fell while advancing up steep hillsides, making themselves easy targets for enemy marksmen. The rain also grounded helicopter support for hours at a time, leaving ground units to fight without the air mobility that was supposed to be their greatest advantage. But gradually, methodically, the 1st Cavalry began to crack the enemy's defensive shell. Superior firepower, better communications, and sheer determination started to tell. Bunker by bunker, hill by hill, the Americans fought their way closer to Khe Sanh. The siege that had lasted over 2 months was finally beginning to break. April 6, 1968, 13:47 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell Page of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, crouched behind a shattered tree stump and peered through his binoculars at the Marine perimeter just 800 meters ahead. After 5 days of brutal fighting through enemy positions, his lead elements were finally within sight of Khe Sanh Combat Base. The red dirt and sandbag bunkers of the besieged garrison looked like the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen. But those final 800 meters might as well have been 800 miles. The ground between the cavalry and the Marines was a moonscape of bomb craters and destroyed vegetation swept by enemy fire from concealed positions. North Vietnamese soldiers were making their final stand, determined to inflict maximum casualties on the relief force, even as their siege crumbled around them. Page's radio crackled with the voice of Marine Colonel David Lowndes, commander of the Khe Sanh garrison. "Pegasus 6, this is Niagara. We can see your people from our positions. Welcome to the neighborhood." The emotion in Lowndes' voice was unmistakable. After 67 days of isolation, help had finally arrived. The final push began at 1400 hours with a coordinated assault by 3 companies of the 2nd Battalion. Cobra. Gunships swept in low, their rockets and machine guns raking suspected enemy positions, while artillery from the newly established fire bases pounded the approaches to the Marine perimeter. The noise was deafening, a crescendo of explosions and automatic weapons fire that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez from San Antonio was in the lead squad when they broke through the final enemy positions. "I saw this Marine standing in a trench, just staring at us like he couldn't believe we were real," Rodriguez later recalled. "He was skinny as a rail, covered in mud, but he had this huge grin on his face. He kept saying, 'You made it, you actually made it.'" The first physical contact came at 14:30 hours when Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the cavalry shook hands with Marine Corporal Danny Williams at the northeastern edge of the base perimeter. Both men were crying, though neither would admit it later. Williams had been living in bunkers for over 2 months, surviving on half rations and rainwater. O'Brien had been fighting through enemy positions for 6 days to reach him. The handshake lasted only seconds, but it marked the end of one of the longest sieges in American military history. Within minutes, the trickle of cavalry soldiers became a flood, as entire companies poured through the gaps in the enemy lines. The Marines who emerged from their bunkers to greet the relief force looked like survivors of some natural disaster. Hollow-eyed, emaciated, their uniforms rotted by months of monsoon rains and constant wear. Many hadn't seen sunlight in weeks, living entirely underground to escape the daily artillery barrages. The emotional reunions were interrupted by the urgent business of war. Helicopter landing zones were immediately established to bring in medical supplies and evacuate the most seriously wounded Marines. CH-47 Chinook helicopters began shuttling loads of food, ammunition, and fresh water to the base that had been cut off from resupply for over 2 months. The contrast between the relieving force and the relieved was stark. The cavalry soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, and relatively fresh from their recent arrival in the area. The Marines were gaunt, their equipment worn and patched, their faces bearing the 1,000-yard stare that came from too many days under fire. But they were alive, and they were no longer alone. Radio intercepts revealed the enemy's reaction to the successful link-up. "The Americans have broken through," one North Vietnamese commander reported. "The siege is finished. Begin withdrawal to secondary positions." After months of confident broadcasts mocking American supply convoys, the enemy's tone had changed completely. The hunters had become the hunted. As the sun set on April 6th, American flags flew over Khe Sanh Combat Base for the first time in over 2 months without the sound of incoming artillery. The siege was broken, The Marines were saved, and Operation Pegasus had achieved its primary objective, but the real work was just beginning. The bulldozers arrived at dawn on April 8th, their diesel engines roaring as they began the monumental task of clearing Route 9. For over 2 months, the highway had been a graveyard of twisted metal and burned-out vehicles. Now, it would become the symbol of American determination to restore the supply lines that had been severed by enemy action. Colonel Robert Brewer, the engineer in charge of the road-clearing operation, surveyed the devastation with grim satisfaction. "This road is going to carry American supplies again," he told his subordinates. "The enemy thought they could cut our lifeline permanently. They were wrong." The challenges were staggering. The Viet Cong had destroyed every bridge along the 20-mile stretch of highway between Ka Lu and Khe San. Massive bomb craters from B-52 strikes dotted the roadway, some large enough to swallow an entire truck. Abandoned vehicles from failed convoy attempts blocked key choke points, their rusted hulks serving as monuments to earlier defeats. But the biggest obstacle wasn't the physical damage, it was the mines. The enemy had seeded Route 9 with hundreds of anti-vehicle mines, pressure-activated devices that could destroy a truck or kill a road-clearing crew. Every foot of highway had to be swept by engineers with metal detectors, a painstaking process that moved at a crawl under the constant threat of sniper fire from the surrounding hills. The work proceeded around the clock despite enemy harassment. North Vietnamese forces, retreating from their positions around Khe San, conducted hit-and-run attacks on the engineering crews. Mortar rounds fell sporadically on the work sites, forcing the engineers to dive for cover and then resume their dangerous work. Snipers picked at the road crews from concealed positions, turning every day into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Security for the engineering operation required an entire battalion of infantry. Soldiers from the 1st Cavalry established defensive positions along the highway, their presence allowing the engineers to work with some degree of safety. Helicopter gunships patrolled overhead, ready to respond to any enemy activity with immediate firepower. The first major breakthrough came on April 12th, when engineers completed a temporary bridge over the Rao Quan River. The original span had been destroyed by enemy sappers in January, cutting the highway in half. The new bridge was a simple steel structure that could handle the weight of supply trucks, but it represented something far more significant: proof that American engineering could overcome any obstacle the enemy placed in their path. Progress accelerated as more equipment arrived. Heavy, earth-moving machinery was airlifted to forward positions, allowing engineers to fill bomb craters and clear debris at unprecedented speed. Portable Bailey bridges were assembled to span smaller streams and ravines. Mile by mile, the highway began to take shape again. The psychological impact of the road-clearing operation extended far beyond its military significance. Marines at Khe San could hear the bulldozers working their way closer each day, the sound of diesel engines becoming a symbol of hope and determination. The enemy's mockery of American supply convoys had been answered by an engineering effort that refused to accept defeat. On April 15th, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The first supply convoy in over 2 months rolled down Route 9 toward Khe San, escorted by armored vehicles and covered by helicopter gunships. The lead truck carried fresh food, medical supplies, and mail from home, items that had become precious beyond measure during the long siege. Lieutenant Colonel David Lowndes watched from the base perimeter as the convoy approached. The sight of American trucks moving freely down Route 9 was almost surreal after months of isolation. "I never thought I'd be so happy to see a supply truck," he told his staff. "But those vehicles represent everything we've been fighting for." The convoy's arrival marked more than just the restoration of ground supply lines. It proved that American logistics could adapt and overcome any challenge the enemy presented. The Viet Cong commanders, who had once mocked fat American supply trucks, were now witnessing the resurrection of the very system they thought they had destroyed. Route 9 was open again, and the supplies were flowing. With Route 9 reopened and Khe Sanh resupplied, the 1st Cavalry Division faced a new mission: hunting down the enemy forces that had terrorized American supply convoys for months. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the tables were turning in ways the Viet Cong never expected. Intelligence gathered from captured positions revealed the sophisticated network the enemy had built around Khe Sanh. Maps found in abandoned bunkers showed supply routes, weapons caches, and communication centers that had supported the siege for over 2 months. The North Vietnamese hadn't just surrounded the Marine base. They had created an entire military infrastructure in the mountains, complete with underground hospitals, ammunition depots, and command centers. Captain Michael Harrison of the 1st Squadron, 9th Cavalry, led the reconnaissance teams tasked with tracking down these hidden installations. His unit, known as the Headhunters, specialized in finding enemy forces that preferred to remain invisible. "These guys thought they were ghosts," Harrison later recalled. "But ghosts leave footprints, and we knew how to read them." The hunt began with aerial reconnaissance missions that photographed every square mile of terrain around Khe Sanh. Photo interpreters pored over the images, looking for telltale signs of enemy activity: worn trails, disturbed vegetation, cooking smoke, anything that might reveal the location of hidden installations. What they found was staggering in its scope and sophistication. The enemy had built an underground city in the mountains. Tunnel networks connected bunkers, supply depots, and command posts across miles of terrain. Some tunnels were large enough for trucks to drive through, allowing the movement of heavy weapons and supplies without detection from American aircraft. The system had taken months to construct and represented a massive investment in time, labor, and resources. But the enemy's greatest strength, their ability to hide, was about to become their greatest weakness. The same tunnel systems that had protected them from bombing now became traps as American forces systematically sealed the exits. Helicopter-borne assault teams landed at suspected tunnel entrances, while ground forces moved to block escape routes. The enemy found themselves trapped in their own underground fortresses. The first major discovery came on April 18th, when cavalry troopers found a massive ammunition depot hidden in a cave complex 5 miles north of Khe Sanh. The cache contained over 500 tons of weapons and explosives, enough to supply an entire regiment for months of combat. Rockets, mortar rounds, AK-47 rifles, and anti-aircraft guns were stacked floor to ceiling in chambers carved from solid rock. Interrogation of captured enemy soldiers revealed the extent of their intelligence network. The Viet Cong had maintained detailed records of American convoy schedules, radio frequencies, and unit movements. Files found in abandoned command bunkers contained photographs of American officers, maps of base layouts, and even personal information about individual soldiers obtained through their spy network. The discovery that shocked American commanders most was the enemy's communication center, found intact in a deep bunker near Hill 881. The installation contained sophisticated radio equipment capable of intercepting American communications across the entire northern region of South Vietnam. Banks of radios, code books, and transmission schedules showed how the enemy had been able to predict and ambush supply convoys with such devastating accuracy. But perhaps the most revealing discovery was a cache of propaganda materials that showed how the enemy had planned to exploit their victory at Khe Sanh. Prepared broadcasts and leaflets proclaimed the great victory over American imperialism, and detailed plans for expanding the siege to other American bases. The enemy had been so confident of success that they had already prepared their victory celebration. As April progressed, the systematic destruction of enemy infrastructure continued. Tunnel complexes were sealed with explosives, supply caches were destroyed or captured, and communication centers were demolished. The network that had supported the siege of Khe Sanh was being methodically dismantled by forces that could strike anywhere, anytime. The psychological impact on surviving enemy forces was devastating. Radio Intercepts revealed growing panic among North Vietnamese commanders who realized their impregnable positions were being overrun by an enemy they couldn't match. "The Americans have learned to fight like us," one captured officer admitted. "They appear from the sky without warning and strike where we least expect them." The hunters had indeed become the hunted, and the American forces were proving to be very effective predators. By April 20th, the mountains around Khe Sanh had fallen eerily quiet. The daily artillery barrages that had terrorized the Marine base for over 2 months simply stopped. The mortar attacks that had killed and wounded hundreds of Americans ceased without warning. The enemy forces that had maintained a stranglehold on the region for so long were vanishing like smoke in the wind. Major General John Tolson studied the intelligence reports with growing frustration. His 1st Cavalry Division had broken the siege, reopened Route 9, and systematically destroyed enemy infrastructure throughout the region. But the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces they had come to fight were disappearing faster than his troops could find them. It was like chasing shadows in the mountains. The enemy's withdrawal wasn't a chaotic retreat. It was a masterpiece of military deception and tactical movement. Radio intercepts revealed coded orders for a strategic repositioning that had been planned weeks in advance. The North Vietnamese High Command had never intended to fight a decisive battle at Khe Sanh. They had accomplished their real objective, tying down massive American resources while the Tet Offensive struck targets across South Vietnam. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade's battalion discovered the first signs of the withdrawal on April 21st when they overran a major enemy position on Hill 689 without firing a shot. The bunkers that had resisted American attacks for days were empty, their occupants gone without a trace. Equipment too heavy to carry had been destroyed or buried, but the soldiers themselves had vanished into the jungle like ghosts. The enemy's ability to disappear was both infuriating and impressive. Entire regiments that had been identified through intelligence reports simply melted away into the civilian population. North Vietnamese regulars shed their uniforms and became farmers working in rice paddies. Viet Cong fighters returned to villages where they had lived double lives for years, hiding their weapons and resuming their cover identities. American forces found evidence of the withdrawal everywhere, but could rarely catch the withdrawing troops. Abandoned camps still warm from cooking fires, supply caches hastily buried or destroyed, communication equipment smashed beyond repair. The enemy had left behind a trail of destruction that showed their haste to escape, but the people responsible were nowhere to be found. Helicopter reconnaissance missions revealed the scale of the evacuation. Aerial observers reported seeing long columns of people moving along jungle trails at night. But by the time ground forces could reach those locations, the trails were empty. The enemy was using the same network of paths and hideouts that had supported their siege of Khe Sanh to facilitate their escape from the region. The few prisoners captured during the withdrawal provided glimpses into the enemy's state of mind. A North Vietnamese lieutenant captured near the DMZ admitted that morale had collapsed after American forces broke through their defensive positions. "We thought we were invincible in these mountains," he told his interrogators. "But your helicopters changed everything. We could not fight an enemy that attacked from the sky." Local intelligence sources reported that enemy commanders were furious about the failure of their anti-aircraft defenses. The surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns that were supposed to neutralize American helicopter operations had proven largely ineffective against the 1st Cavalry's tactics. The Americans had learned to fly low and fast, using terrain features to mask their approach and overwhelming enemy positions with concentrated firepower. By April 25th, the withdrawal was essentially complete. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 15,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops had simply vanished from the Khe Sanh area in less than a week. Some had retreated across the DMZ into North Vietnam. Others had dispersed into Laos and Cambodia, and many had gone underground in South Vietnamese villages where they would wait for orders to resume operations. The silence that settled over the mountains was almost more unsettling than the constant bombardment had been. American patrols found themselves walking through positions that had been heavily defended just days earlier, now abandoned and empty. The enemy who had mocked American supply convoys and besieged Khe Sanh for over 2 months had accomplished their final tactical masterpiece, a withdrawal so complete and so well executed that their opponents were left fighting shadows in the mist. The silence that descended on Khe Sanh Combat Base on April 30th, 1968, was deafening after 77 days of constant bombardment. Operation Pegasus was officially declared complete, but the real work of understanding what had happened was just beginning. The numbers that emerged from the aftermath painted a picture of both triumph and tragedy that would haunt military planners for decades. American casualties for the siege and relief operation totaled 679 killed and 1,418 wounded, a staggering price for holding a remote outpost that would be abandoned just 3 months later. The 1st Cavalry Division alone lost 142 men during Operation Pegasus, with another 731 wounded in the fighting to break through enemy positions. Each number represented a family destroyed, a future cut short, a young man who would never come home. The Marines who had endured the siege paid an even heavier price. Of the 6,000 men who had been trapped at Khe Sanh, over 400 were killed and 1,600 wounded during the 77-day ordeal. Many survivors would carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Combat stress reactions, what military psychiatrists now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected nearly half the garrison. These men had been pushed beyond human endurance and would never be the same. Material losses were equally staggering. The enemy had destroyed or damaged over 200 American aircraft during the siege, including helicopters, transport planes, and fighter bombers worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Thousands of tons of supplies had been lost to enemy action or scattered uselessly across the mountains when parachute drops missed their targets. The cost of Operation Niagara alone, the B-52 bombing campaign, exceeded $100 million in 1968 dollars. But counting enemy casualties proved nearly impossible. Body counts, the military's preferred metric for measuring success, were notoriously unreliable in Vietnam. Conservative estimates suggested that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces lost between 10,000 and 15,000 men during the siege and relief operation, but these numbers were based largely on guesswork and propaganda rather than hard evidence. The enemy's ability to remove their dead and wounded made accurate casualty assessment impossible. Unlike American forces, who meticulously tracked every loss, the North Vietnamese treated casualty figures as state secrets. Bodies were quickly buried or removed from battlefields, wounded fighters were evacuated through tunnel systems, and unit strength reports were classified at the highest levels. What was clear was the massive investment both sides had made in the Khe Sanh operation. The United States had committed over 100,000 troops to the region, including the entire 1st Cavalry Division, multiple Marine battalions, and extensive Air Force assets. The enemy had deployed at least 20,000 troops in a coordinated campaign that stretched their logistics to the breaking point. The strategic implications of Operation Pegasus extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. American military doctrine had been fundamentally changed by the success of helicopter-borne operations. The 1st Cavalry had proven that air mobility could overcome even the most sophisticated enemy defenses, but only at enormous cost in men and resources. Intelligence assessments revealed that the enemy had achieved many of their strategic objectives despite their tactical defeat. The siege of Khe Sanh had tied down massive American resources during the crucial weeks of the Tet Offensive, preventing those forces from defending major cities across South Vietnam. While American attention was focused on the remote mountain base, enemy forces had struck at the heart of South Vietnamese society. The psychological impact on both sides would prove longer lasting than the physical damage. American confidence in conventional military superiority had been shaken by an enemy that could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear back into the population. The invincibility that had characterized American military thinking since World War II was gone forever. For the enemy, the lessons were equally profound. Their mockery of American supply convoys had been answered by an air mobility campaign that could deliver troops and supplies anywhere, anytime. The static defensive positions they had relied on for decades were suddenly vulnerable to attack from above. The rules of warfare had changed, and they would have to adapt or die. As the last helicopter lifted off from Khe Sanh on July 5, 1968, the base was abandoned just 3 months after being relieved. The true cost of the operation became clear. Both sides had paid an enormous price for a piece of ground that ultimately meant nothing. The supply war that had begun with enemy mockery had ended with mutual exhaustion and a recognition that Vietnam would be unlike any war either side had ever fought. The real significance of Operation Pegasus wasn't measured in body counts or territory captured. It was found in the strategic chess game that had been playing out across Southeast Asia while the world's attention focused on a remote mountain base in South Vietnam. What appeared to be a tactical victory for American forces was actually part of a much larger and more complex campaign that would reshape the entire Vietnam War. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the North Vietnamese military mastermind who had defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, had never intended Khe Sanh to be his Stalingrad. Intelligence documents captured years later revealed that the siege was always meant to be a diversion, a massive deception operation designed to draw American forces away from South Vietnam's major population centers during the most ambitious offensive in the war's history. While 100,000 American troops focused on saving 6,000 Marines in the mountains, 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive struck at the heart of American strategy, proving that no target was safe and no victory was permanent. Saigon, Da Nang, Hue, and dozens of other urban centers erupted in violence while American commanders worried about a remote base that most Americans couldn't find on a map. The timing was no coincidence. Enemy planners had studied American psychology and understood that the siege of Khe Sanh would trigger memories of Dien Bien Phu and the French defeat that ended colonial rule in Indochina. President Johnson's obsession with preventing another Dien Bien Phu played directly into enemy hands, forcing American military leaders to commit massive resources to defending a position that had limited strategic value. But the enemy's strategic success came at a devastating tactical cost. The Tet Offensive, while psychologically powerful, was a military disaster that destroyed the Viet Cong as an effective fighting force. Most of the 80,000 attackers were killed or captured during the urban battles, leaving the insurgency dependent on North Vietnamese regulars for future operations. The very success of their deception at Khe Sanh had lured them into a premature offensive that decimated their ranks. Operation Pegasus represented something equally significant for American forces, proof that military innovation could overcome even the most sophisticated enemy strategies. The 1st Cavalry Division's helicopter assault tactics weren't just a tactical breakthrough. They were a revolution in military thinking that would influence warfare for decades to come. The ability to deliver combat power anywhere, anytime, regardless of terrain or enemy defenses, fundamentally changed the nature of modern conflict. The success of air mobility operations at Khe Sanh influenced military doctrine far beyond Vietnam. The principles pioneered by the 1st Cavalry, rapid deployment, vertical envelopment, and overwhelming firepower delivered from unexpected directions, became standard tactics for armies around the world. The helicopter had evolved from a medical evacuation platform to the dominant weapon system of modern warfare. But the broader implications extended beyond military tactics to the very nature of American involvement in Vietnam. Operation Pegasus marked the high watermark of American confidence in technological solutions to political problems. The success of the relief operation reinforced the belief that superior firepower and mobility could overcome any enemy, regardless of their motivation or local advantages. This technological optimism would prove tragically misplaced. The enemy's withdrawal from Khe Sanh wasn't a defeat. It was a tactical redeployment that allowed them to continue fighting for 7 more years. The same forces that had besieged the Marine base simply melted back into the population, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. American military superiority could win battles, but it couldn't win a war against an enemy that refused to fight on American terms. The political implications were equally profound. Operation Pegasus provided the Johnson administration with a much-needed victory at a time when public support for the war was collapsing. The dramatic rescue of surrounded Marines played well on television and in newspaper headlines, temporarily obscuring the larger strategic failures revealed by the Tet Offensive. However, the victory was hollow. Within 3 months of being relieved, Khe Sanh Combat Base was abandoned and dismantled. The position that had cost so much blood and treasure to defend was quietly evacuated, its strategic value finally recognized as negligible. The supply routes that had been reopened at such great cost were closed again, the mountains returning to enemy control. Operation Pegasus had saved the Marines at Khe Sanh, but it couldn't save American strategy in Vietnam. The war would continue for 7 more years, claiming thousands more lives in pursuit of objectives that remained as elusive as the enemy forces that had vanished into the mist-covered mountains of Quang Tri Province. The lessons that emerged from the supply war around Khe Sanh would reshape American military doctrine for decades to come. What had begun as enemy mockery of fat American supply trucks had evolved into a comprehensive study in the vulnerabilities and strengths of modern logistics warfare. The price of that education was measured in blood, but the knowledge gained would save countless lives in future conflicts. The most immediate change was in convoy security procedures. Never again would American supply vehicles travel Route 9 or similar highways without massive security escorts. The new doctrine required mine-clearing teams to sweep every mile of road before convoys could pass, helicopter gunships to provide overwatch from above, and infantry units to secure high ground along the entire route. What had once been a simple truck run became a major military operation requiring hundreds of troops and extensive coordination. Intelligence gathering received a complete overhaul after the catastrophic security failures that had allowed the enemy to predict every American move. The discovery that Viet Cong spies had infiltrated South Vietnamese units at the highest levels led to new procedures for compartmentalizing operational information. Radio communications were encrypted using more sophisticated codes. Convoy schedules were distributed on a need-to-know basis, and counterintelligence operations were expanded to identify and eliminate enemy agents. The success of Operation Pegasus revolutionized air mobility operations throughout the American military. The 1st Cavalry Division's tactics became the template for rapid deployment forces around the world. Helicopter assault techniques pioneered in the mountains around Khe Sanh were refined and standardized, creating new doctrine for vertical envelopment that would influence military thinking for generations. The ability to bypass enemy strongpoints and attack from unexpected directions became a cornerstone of American tactical doctrine. But the enemy had learned lessons too, and they adapted with frightening speed. Within months of Operation Pegasus, North Vietnamese forces were deploying more sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons specifically designed to counter American helicopter operations. Surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, and improved small arms tactics made helicopter operations increasingly dangerous. The technological advantage that had broken the siege of Khe Sanh was already being eroded by enemy countermeasures. The psychological warfare aspects of the supply war had profound implications for future conflicts. The enemy's use of mockery and propaganda to undermine American morale proved that modern warfare was as much about perception as it was about firepower. American commanders learned that controlling the narrative was just as important as controlling the battlefield. Public affairs operations were expanded, and greater attention was paid to the psychological impact of military operations on both friendly and enemy forces. Supply chain security became a permanent obsession for American military planners. The vulnerability of logistics networks, revealed during the Khe Sanh siege, led to fundamental changes in how supplies were moved, stored, and protected. Redundant supply routes were established wherever possible, supply depots were hardened against attack, and new procedures were developed for emergency resupply operations when ground routes were compromised. The integration of different military services during Operation Pegasus created new models for joint operations. The coordination between Air Force bombers, Army helicopters, Marine infantry, and Navy fighters required unprecedented cooperation between services that had traditionally operated independently. The success of this integration led to new joint doctrine that emphasized unified command structures and inter-service cooperation. Medical evacuation procedures were revolutionized by the experiences at Khe Sanh. The difficulty of evacuating wounded Marines during the siege highlighted the need for more robust medical support in isolated positions. New procedures were developed for helicopter medical evacuation under fire. Forward surgical teams were established to provide immediate care, and medical supplies were given higher priority in resupply operations. The enemy's tunnel networks around Khe Sanh led to new American tactics for underground warfare. Specialized tunnel detection equipment was developed, new techniques were created for clearing and destroying tunnel systems, and training programs were established to prepare soldiers for subterranean combat. The discovery of the sophisticated enemy infrastructure hidden beneath the mountains changed American understanding of what the enemy was capable of achieving. Communication security received massive improvements after the discovery that enemy forces had been intercepting American radio transmissions with devastating accuracy. New encryption systems were deployed, radio procedures were tightened, and electronic warfare units were expanded to detect and counter enemy intercept operations. The realization that the enemy had been listening to American communications for months led to a complete overhaul of battlefield communication security. Perhaps most importantly, the supply war around Khe Sanh taught American commanders that technological superiority alone wasn't enough to guarantee victory. The enemy's ability to adapt, improvise, and persist despite overwhelming firepower demonstrated that modern warfare required more than just superior equipment. Understanding enemy psychology, maintaining operational security, and sustaining the will to fight were just as important as having the best weapons and the most advanced technology. These lessons would be tested again and again in future conflicts, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan. The supply war that began with enemy mockery had become a textbook study in the complexities of modern warfare. The Viet Cong commanders who once mocked American supply convoys learned a harsh lesson when Operation Pegasus unleashed the full power of air mobility warfare. Their confident broadcasts about fat American trucks were silenced by helicopters that could deliver combat power anywhere, anytime. The siege they thought was impregnable crumbled in just 6 days of sustained assault. Subscribe for more untold stories of how technology changed warfare forever.